Hi, Jamie.
How does it sound?
Oh, you sound good.
So do you.
This is our weekly, how do I sound? You sound good. You sound good.
I used to not care one bit whether I sounded good.
You sound good. So here's the thing. People have been letting us know that they really like our dynamic. I think what people don't know is that you and I are also getting to know each other. Let me throw this question out for you. What is a kind of food that you eat that potentially turns other people off? For me, it's licorice. How about for you? Like, what'd you have for breakfast this morning?
I put anchovies on my poached eggs this morning. Poached eggs, broccoli, and anchovies.
Okay. That sounds a little different. When I taught third grade, I would say, you have to say that's interesting. Interesting. You couldn't say gross. Interesting. So we'd take a walking field trip of Chinatown in Oakland, and the kids would, see things in the windows, and they have to say, interesting, not ew or gross. And then one day I was walking them through the lunch line, and the milk was spoiled. And they were drinking the milk and going, interesting. And I went, not interesting, gross.
It was junky. That's junky.
That's gross.
I am so interested to hear what you think of Mr. Marshall.
I'm really glad you asked me that question, because this is a really different kind of conversation. This is an individual, absolutely has credentials, who has worked as an administrator. And at the same time, he has made a name for himself based on providing really an essential service to so many leaders in education and the general public who are curious to try to navigate and negotiate all these different theories and opinions around education, educational reform or transformation. And so when I think about it, I thought it was fascinating to me. Like, here's an individual who has spent so many years now, like, he is completely and absolutely dedicated to going through educational research and providing you with a summary of it. And so, like, I'm going through the conversation, I'm thinking, I love he talked about the different phases of like how he goes through creating the Marshall Memo. And to me, that was interesting in terms of process. Any one of us can listen and think about, how do I, whether you call it an ethic of excellence or whatever, there's a process to this work that we do. And I think that's interesting. I thought also when he paused for a moment and revealed his own mistakes and growth as a principal, I thought, I think our listeners are going to find that really interesting, that while he does all this technical work, he also, it's grounded in this vulnerability. I think he said, it's just about got fired my first year. I made some serious mistakes. Jamie, what about you? As you're looking at this, what were some of the things that you noticed?
His job is to, quote, what did he call it? Combing through the haystack to find the needle, the good stuff. And then the second part is the hard work of writing a good, intellectually responsible summary of each article. Who determines what's good?
That's another question I didn't ask him. I know as he talked about each of the sources that he uses, I think he would say that it's the editors who decide what's good, and then he is culling each of those sources for articles that are timely right now. Let me ask you this, though. Are you familiar with the book Multipliers? I only just learned about it.
I am. I've heard of it. Who wrote it?
Liz Wiseman. She worked at Oracle. She talks about the fact that you're either a multiplier or a diminisher, and that multipliers are in different roles. They can either be talent magnets, they can be liberators, they can be challengers, they can be debaters, they can be investors, and obviously diminishers pull away. So multipliers amplify the people around them. And I thought that was pretty interesting in terms of how one can serve as a multiplier for others. It can be in these kinds of one-on-one conversations that we're having. And to some extent, I was thinking about our guest today because of the fact that by having someone who curates a ton of material, and you and I can totally debate on how do you decide what is good, that one can serve as a multiplier for others by bringing to light research that's being written around education and educational leadership. And so as he was talking about, and you'll hear it in a moment when we do the conversation, you'll hear him talk about the different ways that people can engage the Marshall Memo. And for me, I thought there was an important one for leaders, is how can they serve as a lead learner for their boards of education to be able to provide the board, which is typically made up of well-meaning individuals in your community who do not have an education background, to get access to material that can help them become better board members.
Yeah, I liked that part a lot.
So let's get to it. Listen to the conversation and then come back together. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Today on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Kim Marshall. And Kim is well known among educators nationwide and in more than 70 countries for the weekly publication that he launched in 2003, the Marshall Memo. And the Marshall Memo is a compilation of the very best articles being written about educational issues. And Kim has a process for choosing articles for the Marshall Memo, and we'll get to that in a moment. But first, I want to establish his credentials. So one reason he has credibility among educators across the globe is because he's one of us. He's been a teacher and an administrator, both a building principal and a central office leader in Boston, including the role of the principal of the Mather, established in 1639, making it the oldest elementary school in the nation. Kim, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thanks so much.
Kim, the Marshall Memo, and it's in your words because I got to watch a nice video of you on your website, and I'll put the link to the website in the show notes, is that the Marshall Memo is a distillation of the best ideas and the best research to help start conversations and perhaps to change the way that people teach and lead. And you do such a marvelous job describing your process for choosing topics for the 50 issues each year. And I wonder, would you talk a little bit about the Marshall Memo? And really, I think what I'd like you to do is to share what compelled you to create it, as well as the process that you've used for the more than 20 years that you've been selecting topics.
So as a principal, I struggled to do my professional reading. I subscribed to Education Week and Kaplan and Ed Leadership and a few others. And there was weekends and vacations when I would occasionally catch up. At one point, I was listening to Educational Leadership on a cassette tape in my car driving to work. And that wasn't so hot for taking notes or even really making note of
That's
them.
right. Arrive alive.
I was on a continual guilt trip as a principal of keeping up with the reading. So when I stopped being a principal after 15 years at the Mather, I said, now I have time to read. And I proposed the idea to my then new boss at New Leaders for New Schools, because now I'm coaching principals. I have a little more time. I'm traveling. What about a weekly wishing people happy birthday and maybe a summary of an article? And he said, no, we're not going to do that. So a few months later, I said, maybe I can do this myself. And I pitched it to a couple of people and got some initial financial support to get me going, and started a weekly routine of reading on Sunday, reading through what I subscribed to at that point, which was not that many publications. And then on Monday, sitting down and writing a short summary of each one. It's a two-part process. The first one is combing through the haystack to find the needle, the good stuff. And then the second part is just the hard work of writing a good, intellectually responsible summary of each article. So that was almost 21 years ago. And the routine of once a week turned out to be about the right frequency. Sunday was about 8 hours. It was enough time to sit down in a comfortable chair and read through and find those good articles. And now I'm reading or skimming about 150 articles a week because I subscribe now to everything. It's a significant investment subscribing to all these things because some of them are pretty expensive. And then Monday has continued to be the writing day. And that's actually gotten longer because now it's about 11 hours to write these summaries. And my wife comes home from her job. She's also in education as a lawyer. And after dinner, we read it together. And she's a terrific editor. So we find a lot of typos, but also judgment calls and a little shorter on that one or change the sequence. And I have a sending sequence to send it out to my subscribers. So that's the weekly process, basically 2 very full days of putting this thing together.
I was going to shamelessly plug the fact that I had one of my articles in the Marshall Memo and how I learned about it because I wasn't familiar with the Marshall Memo, except for all of a sudden, all these educator friends that I have at both the educational leadership level, at the college level, and the K-12 arena, all of a sudden were like, hey, you made the Marshall Memo. So I was super, super excited. Are there any issues that pop out to you since you started covering educational issues that really prompt a mindset shift either for yourself or that you've noticed that sort of large group of readers have begun changing the way that they think about things?
As things go in waves. So there were, for example, in the Obama years, there was a wave of interest in teachers' evaluation. Then there's a wave of interest in PLCs and teacher teams looking at assessments, and a wave of interest in assessments, especially formative on-the-spot assessments, and then DEI and race and equity. And so things come in waves. I would say one of the biggest mind shifts for me was the whole thing of on-the-spot, in the class, formative assessment. Like I really, as a teacher, I don't think I ever really got that. Intuitively, okay, I taught long division, but now 3 weeks later, they don't know how to do it. So we got to kick that wheel a little bit. But also the power of on the spot in the moment, like figuring out like during the actual lesson, And it turns out the research on this, and Dylan William, the British guy, is one of the big gurus on this. The research on formative assessment is some of the most powerful research in education. That was a surprise to me. I really didn't know that if you come back to something 15 minutes later and test yourself on it or retrieve it from your brain, that actually cognitively strengthens the memory. And then if you do it again the next morning as a do now in the lesson, that was intriguing to me. Also, I think just to mention one other one, I think the idea of innate ability, that some kids have it and some kids don't. Some kids are just natural mathematicians and some kids are natural dancers or whatever. That I think is deeply instilled in our culture. And so reading again and again about how effective effort, deliberate practice, which is part of good teaching, is one of the key factors in taking kids beyond their innate ability to actually do amazing things. And one of my favorite books on this is The Talent Code. I think I have it at my fingertips here. The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle, just about how extraordinary achievement around the world has come from this process. Of course, a spark of interest and motivation, but then good teaching and deliberate practice. And people who don't seem to be good dancers can actually become good dancers.
They say that the same thing for singers. And then I would even stretch that to teachers who often, you probably heard this as a principal. I certainly did as an elementary school principal. I'm not good at math, right? I'm not. And so I'll extend my read aloud or my writing instruction because I'm not good at math. And that to me seems to suggest that yet sort of thing, right? You haven't practiced enough or done enough of the type of professional development around, whether it's a math congress or those types of thinking about how you teach math and how children come up with answers and knowing how to do that. You mentioned Dylan William. I was thinking of the book Making It Stick, a group of researchers out of WashU who talked about that exactly, how to study, but certainly how do you retain information and do that with the 15 minutes and then the next day and those types of things as a way to make it stick. So I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No, I have it right here.
Yeah, you do? Amazing.
Of Chip and Dan Heath is the book Made to Stick. And then there's a second book with a similar title, Make It Stick. So they're right behind each other here on my shelf. Made to Stick, Make It Stick. But both
amazing.
Similar, the brain research and cognitive psychology has taught us a lot about how you can actually get smarter. And then that's back to Howard Gardner. It's not how smart you are, it's how you are smart.
Exactly. Yes. I have my Gardner books right there. My frames of mind, the school of mind, multiple intelligences, and intelligences reframed. Yeah, totally.
I've actually been working on Howard Gardner, who I know, to add a ninth intelligence to his list.
Oh, so what are you lobbying for?
I believe the ninth intelligence is the intelligence of the right tool to use or the right weapon to use. And I think this evolutionarily is very important as a tool. What's the right knife to cut open this grapefruit and dissection this grapefruit? But in terms of weapon, my life is in danger. What is around here that I can use as a weapon? I think that is
fascinating. Considering also if you're thinking about what technology to leverage for whatever it is you're trying to solve.
I haven't talked Howard into it yet, but
I imagine he gets lobbied quite a bit. When I was thinking about writing my dissertation around multiple intelligences and second language learning, he was really lovely to respond to my initial email and said, I think there is a school in Indonesia. And I said, yeah, I don't have the funding to travel to Indonesia. I think I'm going to look at why children learn or don't learn English through how the system has been set up. But I'll remain interested through my connection to Thomas Herr and his school in the St. Louis area as well. Amazing. I wrote a book in the past year called An Imperfect Leader. And in the book and in the leadership model that I use to advise others, there's a dimension. It's called the leader's learning work. And it really talks about the lead learner, the mind of an organization's work. And inside that dimension, there's a term, harvesting the collective wisdom. And what you've been doing for the last 20 plus years is harvesting the wisdom of researchers and practitioners, making the Marshall Memo the third largest US-based educational publication and helping schools and school districts just make better decisions. And so, Kim, the memo's been impactful for school leaders at every level. Would you talk a little bit about, I've heard you mention this, where you talk about the 5 levels or 5 ways that one might engage with the memo?
The first is obviously reading it yourself. And so the superintendent sits down with it and has a cup of coffee and goes through, and it takes about 20 minutes if you read all the way through, which is your own professional learning. So it's like an ongoing graduate course for an individual. And that's great. I know people are reading it at that level just to develop their own thinking. The second level is, and I give permission for people to do this, is to clip and share articles with colleagues. So, for example, here's an article about the 4 questions that a history teacher should be asking and putting together a history. My social studies teacher, so I'm going to give it to them, or I'm going to bring it to their meeting and have them talk it through. Or here's an article about literacy. There's been this big fight, is the so-called science of reading debate that's going on, the phonics debate, the latest edition of it. And so here's an article about 3Qing that I think our kindergarten and first grade teachers would be. So people have permission to do that. And a lot of people do that. And it makes the principal and superintendent look smart to have found this great article. And it's a summary, so it's short to read.
I imagine they also are sharing it with their school boards in a Friday report or things like that, which also lends them the ability to begin sharing ideas or dropping some thoughts so that board members are not totally surprised when they bring up an issue that they may not, because this is not their background, this is not their profession as a full-time job, that they now have a little bit of background knowledge.
I have some school board members who read it. That's a really useful thing. Also, some superintendents will say in each monthly principals meeting, come with one article, one Marshall Memo article that you are particularly interested in and talk about it. The third level is every Monday night when I'm finished writing and editing with my wife, I then upload everything to the cloud. The key information about each article, the author, the publication, the title, my headline, etc. So it's searchable. Members have access to the archive. So you're interested, for example, in differentiation, or you're interested in race inequities, microaggressions. You're interested in history teaching. You can go in and find articles that are interesting for what you're doing. Maybe you're writing a dissertation or you're in a study group and so forth. So that's a terrific, powerful message. And now with almost 21 years of stuff up there, it's 10,000 articles. So that's the next level. The fourth level is, one thing you may know is that a couple of years ago, I got together with Jen David Lang, who's a good friend of mine, she does a parallel effort. She does something called The Main Idea, which is summarizing an education book each month. I'm doing articles, she's doing books, and we're good friends. We've been in touch over the years. So we decided during the pandemic that we would look in the Marshall Memo archive and find the best articles on specific topics. And we put together 2 books, the best of the Marshall Memo, book 1 and book 2, total of about 900 pages, and published them. And by coincidence, the Gates Foundation got in touch with us and said, Bill Gates has this idea that we should connect theory and practice. We hear you're doing this Marshall Memo. It's interesting. And so we went back and forth for a long time. And the long and short of it was they helped us. They didn't pay for everything, but they helped us to set up a website that makes the 2 books free and online. So it's called thebestofmarshallmemo.org. It's free, no password, very easy access. So you click on, for example, classroom discipline, and there's the chapter from the book with these 13 articles on classroom discipline. Or you click on mathematics and you have the best articles on that. So that's the next level, is going to these super curated collections. I was just in a Jewish day school on Long Island, and they're having issues with social emotional learning, bullying, and online bullying and stuff with their kids. And so I had the leadership team. Oh, actually, this is the 5th level. Okay. So I had them actually get their phones out. There are 13 people are in the room. Go to the bestofmarshallmemo.org website, click on social emotional learning, and then we numbered off around the room. So Peter, you're number 1, I'm number 2, and so forth. Silently read the article summary. So for 5-10 minutes, people read silently. And then we went around and each person summarized their article. So I had this article by so-and-so. Here's what it said. This particular struck me. Here's a quote. Here's what I disagreed with. We went around. So it's about a 40-minute meeting in which we had an in-depth discussion where everybody had read in real time. If we had asked them to read it beforehand, most people would not have been able to do that. But here we had a real-time discussion, and it was powerful. I was walking out of the room with the head of school and the principal, and walking down the corridor, and the head of school said, wow. So that's the 5th dimension, is all faculty, and that could be done with the whole faculty, but live reading. And the essence of the summary is that it takes about an hour for me to do each of these, sometimes 2 hours, is how do I take this 40-page research article or this David Brooks column, which is only 750 words long, how can I distill it into, with all the good quotes, all the good ideas, all the good stories, but make it short so it can be read in 5 minutes. And that makes this kind of exercise possible. So that's a very powerful exercise. So those are the dimensions of the Marshall Memo.
It's really thinking about that 5th phase of giving people that permission and that time, that gift of time to do some reading quietly with their peers, and then to have that circle. That is so, so powerful. I could imagine that the conversation pretty quickly goes to, and why that matters for our school.
Oh, it was so interesting. In this school, there was a 45-minute block laid out for this meeting. And I assumed that all these department heads and assistant principals and everything had to go. So we got to the 45-minute mark. We had gone through everything. Everyone had given their summary. It was great. And then nobody left. And we had another 30 or 35 minutes of just talking about what does this mean for our school?
Right.
And they all just made time for it because it was so in the moment. Gosh, we just read these 13 articles. They were fantastic, great variety. It was powerful. And I, as a principal, always felt guilty about having people in a staff meeting read silently. It seemed like a sin. I should be talking. They should be talking. But as long as the articles are short, and that's the key thing, is the summary, because you could not read a 3 or 4 page Kaplan article in a meeting.
Right.
That's not going to happen.
Right. If you're just joining us, our guest today is Kim Marshall, the author and creator of the Marshall Memo. Kim, we've just talked about the 5 different ways that people can use the Marshall Memo. And so now I'd like to think about the fact that so many of us come to you for the resource because we are imperfect and we're trying to figure out ways to get better. So let me ask you this question. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
I think of my painful mistakes as a principal. I just about got fired my first year. I made some serious mistakes, and it had to do with shooting from the hip. There was a crisis where I had some very resistant people. They took an instant dislike to me as a sort of smart-ass Harvard guy who had been in the central office and just declared war on me. And they circulated this very subversive, sarcastic newsletter in people's mailboxes. And this is before social media. And I accused somebody based on their handwriting. And I was wrong, and the staff rose up and in rebellion. And even the people who thought I was doing a good job just thought it was outrageous. And so I didn't learn. I learned from that. I almost lost my job, but I learned from that. You do a little intel. You ask around. You say to talk to people just off the record. What's going on here, and how should I handle this? Because obviously I had to stand up to it. It was very subversive. That was a searing experience for me. Another big mistake I made in the early years as a principal was I did the traditional teacher evaluation process. I went in and I sat and I took detailed notes and I wrote it up in a page and a half write-up, and I sat with the teacher and everything. And it literally, and I was really good at it. And it was literally 6 years in when a teacher pulled me aside and said, Kim, we actually don't read those. We just look at our rating. And it was real. I just said, what? I'm putting all this work. I have young children. I'm falling asleep reading to them because I'm so tired from doing all this, and you're not reading them. And to make matters worse, in a staff meeting, people said, well, you don't appreciate us. And I said, well, what do you mean? I'm in your classrooms. I write up these things. I have lots of appreciation and so forth. They said, no, you don't appreciate and understand what we're doing. And this was my turning point to understanding that I needed to completely let go of the worthless. And by the way, 21 years of reading the research, it's very clear that traditional evaluation just doesn't work. And it's hobbling principals and taking over 100 hours of their time every year. So I have a book about this, actually the 3rd edition. I just got the hard copies. So we have the 3rd edition of...
I had to make some choices about whether or not I was going to ask you about evaluation, because in doing a little bit of research about you and your work, I found some rubrics and ways of rethinking the way evaluations are conducted.
Yeah. Rubrics are the least important part of what I've done. I have a good teacher evaluation rubric, which is widely used, but the main thing is how to use it. And I was in a district in New Hampshire a couple of days ago where they were using the rubric, my beautiful rubric, to go into a classroom and score the teacher in real time. Oh my gosh, what an ineffective practice. You can't do that. The rubric is at the end of the year, multiple visits, and had multiple face-to-face coaching conversations with teachers. Then with the teacher's self-assessment, you can put together a pretty accurate picture of the teacher. But this is my big campaign. I'm on the road a lot every week. When I finish the memo, I'm usually on a train to New York or somewhere else, driving up to New Hampshire or going to Arizona or whatever, to try to convince people. And the really good thing that's happened is during the Obama years, there was this idea that we need to hold teachers accountable by using their test scores and by using this very scientific formula, the value add formula or student learning objectives, to evaluate teachers based on whether the kids are learning. So Obama had the right idea, he and Arnie Duncan, which is student learning is what this is all about. But unfortunately, the science, their advice was very poor, the advice on what to use, because the value add formulas have been found to be extremely inaccurate at the individual teacher level. And teachers have brought lawsuits, they've won all the lawsuits. And at the end of his administration, Obama conceded that, and in the 2015 ESSA legislation, they took all that away. But only now, almost 10 years later, are people saying, like New York and Connecticut just changed their policies. you no longer have to use test scores as part of teachers' evaluation. So now we can actually do the business of getting into classrooms, looking at what's happening, talking to the teacher face-to-face afterward, and really looking at learning right down where it matters. Okay, we just did this quiz. Peter, your kids did much better than mine. We're sitting in our PLC. What did you do? You found a way to teach this. Tell me about it. That's a real PLC meeting when you have something like that.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Kim Marshall, the publisher of the Marshall Memo, a publication he launched in 2003 and is followed by educators all over the world. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. Kim, this is where I say, what happened? Now, you mentioned some things right before our break that I think were really compelling. So at some point, I may have to bother you again to rehash those. But I want to talk about something that I know is deeply personal to you as well. So can you tell me what happened?
So I had one of the things in my head as a leader that I've been told by various people was you can't do too many initiatives at once. You need to just have no more than 2 or 3 major initiatives going. And we had probably 3 or 4 going and we were doing pretty well. We were still down in the student achievement areas and test scores and so forth. And we're getting our act together as a school. I survived my initial crisis in my first year. And a teacher came to me and said, there's a new program, a new reading and writing program that we need to bring in. And the teachers are over at Lesley College and they're really good. And I said, no, we can't do this. That would be one too many initiatives and we would overwhelm people and stress teachers out. And it's just not a good idea. And so she came back and tried again. Kim, this is really good. This is called balanced literacy. It's really fantastic. And I've been to a session on it and I'm excited. And I think it would really be good for our kids. And I said, no, we can't do that. So a third time she comes back and she tries again. And finally I said, okay, let me look at this. And I read a little bit about it and I said, okay, we'll do it. And, but I'm just warning you, this could be bad. It could be way too much for teachers. And fast forward, it was a fantastic hit and turned around our instruction. And then on top of that, we brought in reading recovery, a program for taking one-on-one tutoring with first graders who were struggling. And that was successful. And one of the most interesting things was the reading recovery. There were 2 reading recovery teachers. One of them was just a very tough, she was the union rep. She was hard on me. She did her job. And I would say it changed her life. Just this idea that you could have a first grader who walks into your classroom at the beginning of the year, doesn't know their letters, really low in self-esteem and all this stuff. And this kid can be transformed by this program. And it changed her mind. Kids we can grow their brains. And so that was a good decision. But I had to I needed to be pushed and I had to really change my mindset. And fortunately, I think I chose well, but it was partly because this teacher was just so passionate about it.
So let's dig into this a little bit. First of all, you mentioned reading recovery. My person was Susan Blackburn. So we both have in our minds these amazing educators who are saving the lives of children. And if we would just let them. And what was so interesting to me was when we did a study to look at where were they as third graders, fourth graders, not only did they retain what they had learned as first graders, but really were thriving. And you're bringing up an issue that is very timely because the entire state of Utah, for example, has adopted a science of reading mandate. And so school districts all across that state and across the nation are scrambling to teach phonics. I'm curious, though, this initiative fatigue is a real thing. So it sounds like you were really being cautious and thoughtful about that. One of the things that we do when we do this part of our podcast is we just ask, what happened? So in this case, it sounds like you were asked to investigate and then you were persuaded to begin adding this component of reading instruction to your school building, and it was fruitful. But there had to be pieces that sort of were overlooked as you brought this on board. And I wonder, looking back, what were some things that you wish that you had done differently in terms of what got overlooked?
Gosh, probably math. we weren't so hot at math, and we were downgrading social studies and science and not doing enough of that. I was in a K-5 elementary school. But actually, it might be interesting to turn the question a little bit and say, what if I was an elementary principal now, and in comes this juggernaut to do science of reading and to do more phonics? And I've really done a lot of thinking about this because I'm coaching principals. I'm in schools. I'm at a school north of Boston. I've been on 3 years. I've been working with the principal, and they've been hit with this. And so what would be my perspective? And again, here comes the juggernaut. In this case, the juggernaut is only partly right, because it's true there are some teachers who are not teaching phonics. There's some people who went overboard with the whole language thing, which preceded balanced literacy, the whole language thing, where teachers were literally saying to kids, don't sound it out. Look at the picture. Does it make sense? And we're discouraged from learning phonics, which seemed old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy and pedantic and everything else. So now my judgment as a principal would be, gosh, I've got to read up on this. I got to find out, okay, yeah, so if any of our teachers, and I'm in their classrooms a lot and I'm watching, if any of our teachers are teaching like that, we do definitely need to address that. But what's the overall import of science reading is it's come from Emily Hanford and the Soul the Story podcast, which are very powerful and very skillfully done, is the pendulum has swung too far. Is too much emphasis on phonics. And the interesting thing is I've been reading about this over the last 2 years for the Marshall Memo and selectively summarizing articles. It's very interesting now. If you see Science of Reading in Education Week or the New York Times, people have gradually expanded the definition back to the real science of reading, which includes background knowledge, reading children's books, high quality children's books, looking at language.
That's right. Understanding the arc of the story, those comprehension skills that are essential to understanding more complex story and text.
And also one of the most powerful ways to improve reading, which is writing. It's as if at first the New York Times and Time Magazine and Education Week, they all went down the rabbit hole. And yes, indeed, some people were neglecting that. And okay, we definitely need to look at that. And we also need to look at the fact that way too many children in America don't know how to read well. There is indeed a reading crisis. It's gone back 100 years, and it's a lot of socioeconomic angles to it and racial angles to it as well. The kids who are having the most difficulty are the kids who most need to get better. And so,
well, a big part of that, would you say, also is linked to experiences, vocabulary development, the ability, it has everything to do with your zip code.
So what we know now, and again, I would embrace now the science of reading as the broad research on how to help kids learn how to read, which is an unnatural act and just not something we're born with. And so now, I think now we've gotten to a much better place now, and people understand Scarborough's rope. It's a wonderful graphic that shows a rope with braids. And here are the 8 or so components of becoming a skillful reader, where the words, and you can figure out words and so forth. So we're in a much healthier spot. But as you mentioned, Utah, Ohio, states around the country have this legislation. And so the challenge now for a superintendent or for a principal or for a head of school is understanding this well enough to protect my teachers from something. For example, going off to letters boot camp, LETRS, it's one of the training things, which is actually imperfect, and the research is not slam dunk on it. What's the best way to prepare to make sure that my kindergarten and first grade teachers are doing the best possible job in getting all kids to learn how to read, and not just, it's complicated, but the good work is out there. I actually have an issue. Last summer, I did a special issue of the Marshall Memo, number 997, in which I pulled together all the best writing on the science of reading issue. This is 12 best articles helping to understand this issue. So a superintendent or a principal or a head of school can really know, okay, so here's how I should handle this with my school board. Here's how I should handle it with my PD and so forth.
If you're willing, I think people would really appreciate that, because I think what happened was maybe was it a year ago when Lucy Calkins says, I could have done more in this area of phonics. And I think for many of us who really embraced the Calkins work around writing, and because it required people to be smart and thoughtful, because it wasn't lesson plans that were written for you, but rather you had to think about how you were going to teach, that maybe some of us took away this thought of, I guess I've done something wrong, as opposed to what you're saying is you don't have to look at science of reading as such a restrictive and constricted piece, but rather really see it as a yes and. Yes, we need to learn phonics. And there's all of this other rich work around literacy.
It is true that Lucy Calkins didn't have enough emphasis on phonics in her curriculum. She had other wonderful things, and she conceded that. She's made changes. But Fountas and Pinnell, they've always had phonics. They have not apologized. They have not backed down. And they're also, I know, Irene, they're very upset at the meanness of the attack. Emily Hanford is a skillful journalist, and she's good at what she does, and she is mean. She's cruel. And the things she said about Irene Fountas, Kesu Pinnell, Marie Clay are wrong, ill-informed, and cruel. So I think there's a real aspect of this that is not good at all. But she definitely has a point. Some teachers were neglecting phonics, and we need to deal with that. But I think she estimates 1 in 4 teachers. So we're not talking about large numbers of people, and yet large numbers of teachers around the United States are feeling I've been harming kids for the last 30 years.
That's definitely been the takeaway.
Very unfortunate. This is a relatively easy problem to solve. And by the way, this is the 4th go-around on this. In the 1940s, Eleanor Roosevelt was upset that soldiers coming into the army didn't know how to read. In the 1950s, when I was a kid, Rudolf Flesch published Why Johnny Can't Read, and there was a big panic about phonics. In the 1960s, there was another one. Then George W. Bush, when he was told about 9/11, he was in an elementary classroom listening to a phonics lesson because he was obsessed with this. So actually, it's the 5th time around that we've had this phonics debate. And that to me is intriguing. Like, why? This does not happen in Italy. In Italy, it is a perfectly phonetically regular language, Italian. The letter I is always the E sound. And phonics is taught very quickly, and there's no commissions and there's no debates about this. So it's partly being
That's right. Yeah, I was a Spanish bilingual teacher, and yes, the syllabario is it's pretty easy in terms of like, mame mi mu, pape pi papu. Like, it was fairly easy to teach the phonics and then move forward.
So we've got to get out of this, and I think we are getting out of it because now, again, if you read in Ed Week, mentions of science of reading, it's actually the whole ball of wax. And we shouldn't even use the word science of reading. We should say good research-based practices. And we still have the struggle. How do you deal with a kid with dyslexia? How do you deal with a second language learner? And this comes down to teacher skill, training, and individually treating kids a little bit differently. Because some kids figure out reading all by themselves. They don't need phonics. It's about 5% of kids. Another 40% of kids will learn it no matter who teaches it, even a machine. Another 30%, they need a skilled teacher. And then the hardcore of like 15% of kids who have serious learning disabilities, they need a super skilled teacher.
Yeah, so that's where they need their reading recovery teacher.
Exactly. Or special ed. Differentiation is the key here. So when I see kids being subjected, and I'm seeing this in classrooms, to boring, just repetitive for a lot of kids. The second grader is reading Harry Potter and they're doing Apple. No, that's ridiculous. Godspeed, you superintendents. Just do the right thing here. Help your people understand this and get the right materials and skills into the classrooms.
Let me leave with this question then. What advice do you have for aspiring leaders?
Gosh, I think first of all, choose your district well. Don't go into a situation where you will be forced to do things that are against your values. For example, an ineffective teacher evaluation process, a benighted student literacy program. Interview, when you get to that point in the interview where they say, do you have any questions for us? You should have some good questions. Tell me about your teacher evaluation process. Tell me your literacy program. Tell me about your PLCs. How are those working? PLCs, by the way, is one of my obsessions because they're going so badly around the country. But Rick Dufour had a wonderful formulation of what a good teacher team should be doing. By the way, one of my favorite authors on this whole thing is Karen Chenoweth's book. She has a series of 5 books, but she's basically the latter-day Ron Edmonds. She's the one who's looking at the outlier schools, the schools that are really doing well with the same population of kids where others are doing poorly. And she's figured it out. And she says the magic question that you want to listen for in a teacher team or from principal to principal or from superintendent to superintendent is, Peter, your kids are doing better than mine. What are you doing? So how can we get to the point where we're really learning from best practices? Because there are people out there right now. I'm working with a school in Bedford-Stuyvesant, New York, 100% children of color, 100% children in poverty, that is doing extraordinary stuff. And so the question is, what is that secret sauce? And I've been fascinated with this since the 1970s when I read Ron Evans' work for the first time. There is a science to this, to effective schools and effective teaching. And it shouldn't just be that teacher up in the corner in room 308 doing it by herself. It should be finding those practices and bringing them in. And we know what those practices are. So I think that's, back to your question, the interview question would be, make sure to find a place where you're going to have a reasonable amount of autonomy as a principal or a superintendent, where you can use your judgment, where you can bring in good research, where you can bring in your people, because the lifespan of superintendents is not super long. But I worked with the superintendent in Boston who was there for 10, 11 years, Tom Pesot, a very effective superintendent. He was actually in San Diego for a long time too. Good. And the planets have to line up to the right school board and so forth. But you can make a huge difference as a superintendent, principal, leader, and so forth.
My guest today was Kim Marshall, publisher of the Marshall Memo. And Kim, I'm so grateful for your time. We've learned so much today, certainly about the Marshall Memo and the different ways, 5 different ways that one can use the memo. And I really will encourage people to get on there and to learn more. I know you have an incredibly dedicated following, and I hope that we can add some more people to it. I also really want to thank you for the reminders about initiatives and knowing when to move forward with them, listening to the people that you trust, harvesting the wisdom in lots of different ways. I really have just so enjoyed talking about reading, and I'm just grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Can I just give one other quick plug here?
Please.
Have you seen this book?
Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics.
Okay. So if you want to read one book in the next 6 months, I would recommend this. This is everywhere I'm going now. I am seeing tremendous excitement, grassroots excitement about this book. So he is a Canadian professor at Simon Fraser University. He's done 15 years of research. This is an extremely accessible book. And just super quick summary, you can see the graphic here. The kids are given a very challenging problem, very brief intro. They work then standing up at erasable whiteboards in groups of 3 with one marker. And they have to work together to solve this they work together for 30, 35 minutes solving this problem. So he has rolled this out and he's all over the world. Like 80% of schools in Norway are doing this now. So I was,
believe it or not, I was in the Peruvian Amazon about a month ago in a math class, and the children were working on a math problem in a group of 3 with one pen. And now I know maybe where they learned it from.
Either they invented it themselves, which is
it was really great. I was just watching them talk through. It was a question. It was a subtraction question, and it was meaningful. It was pertinent. The content was applicable to where they lived in their place, and so it wasn't a random question about a city. The children live on the river, and yet they were working together and debating, and it was great.
In Peru. Yeah. So I bet that superintendents listening to this, if you include this part, I bet that almost all of them will have this going in their districts in some way, because it's this amazing grassroots thing that's happening everywhere I go. When I mention this, somebody in the room lights up. Like first grade teacher just up in New Hampshire said, "Oh my God, I'm doing this. It's so fast."
But this is where you go, we don't want it in room just 308. We got to get this as part of the whole system.
And I asked her, "How did you find out about it?" She said, "Online." So it's grassroots, but it's amazing. And it's,
how cool.
Yeah. So a little plug for Peter Liljedahl and his amazing work.
Kim, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Okay. Right out of the gate, tell me one thing that you're thinking about.
This goes to his 5 dimensions of the ways in which to engage the Marshall Memo. And it came up more than once in a bunch of other places. We're back to collectiveness, collective identity again. And with his example being the staff meeting that he led in a 40-minute staff meeting where they all read a piece and all shared. Now, what is interesting is that the clarity of the outcome of that process isn't named. If it's just to be generative, like if the goal of the time spent is we're at the beginning level, we're just generating ideas, we're trying to get inspiration before we decide on action or any of that, then that worked. You get way more.
Oh, that's
collective.
interesting. Yeah, I could imagine we're at the very beginning of strategic planning, which, by the way, I just vomited a little bit in my mouth when I say the word strategic. It's a sign. They wanted to... What is their compelling... Because I think it's more like, what is your compelling purpose? What are we here to do? What do we want to create together? To me, that captures my heart. Strategic planning seems so technical, and I get it. We do want to create, what is our strategy for the next 5 years? If you're at the very beginning of saying, what are we trying to create together? And part of that is mining the collective wisdom of the people in the room, as well as what do we know over the last 5 years or the last 2 years around educational research that we should be thinking about? Because I could imagine where he says, look, the pendulum has swung too far when it comes to the science of reading debate. Too much emphasis on phonics. Look, the real science of reading includes background knowledge and comprehension skills and writing. Like, that is important as you are building your compelling purpose or your strategic plan to say, look, we want to make sure that we are providing great instruction. And here are some examples. If you are not rooting it into what we know is to be true, then we're just using our instincts, which probably the reason why we're in this place right now, because way too often we're just shooting from the hip, kind of. Just calling it strategic planning, I struggle with. So anyway, I'm good.
Yes, 100%. I heard it more than once, the collective, moving toward the collective, including in his final sharing about his last minute share about the math book, Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics. I haven't read it. I don't have it. It's this so I can't wait to read it. It's a grassroots thing. Oh, I'm so interested. I'll get down and try to get in front of this. That it's collective processing. There's one of the best math teachers I ever saw, Algebra 1, 8th or 9th grade, I think 9th grade. She took all the chairs out of her room. All of them, all the desks, all the chairs. She had whiteboards installed around the whole room, and kids worked in small groups on these long, tall whiteboards with dry erase markers. And she stood in the center. That's what they did over and over and over, all collective. Her ability to sort of formative assess in the moment. Now it's only her, it's not a formal process of formative assessment, but she is able to start to examine, and she gets better and better at it. In the beginning, she's bad. It's too much information. But slowly, to the point of practice, he says this earlier, he talks about, I love that language of deliberate practice. She gets better, and she now can understand where they're making mistakes. I think the key in teaching is how good are you at error analysis?
Yes, because it will inform how much productive struggle do you allow.
You got it.
Like, oh, I see what they're thinking. Oh, I see where they're going. Oh, let's see how they pull themselves out of this. Yeah.
The other one that stood out, I thought that was really interesting, the other idea that really resonated for me was, here, in the science of reading conversation. Again, another example of where I love the research that you've culled. Kim Marshall says that the crisis goes back decades, that there are socioeconomic and racial angles to it. And then you mentioned that it's been connected to your zip code. That's called racism. That's what that is. So that the comment about it having racial angles to it, that's schools were not designed to educate every kid. That's not why public schools were first put together. As they have been changed over time by policy, political opinion, upswell, constant fight, that you now are trying to have this structure that wasn't designed to educate every kid. And it perpetually disappoints because its innate structure isn't good at educating every kid. It takes basically super powered people. That's the teacher in 308 that's mentioned, who is super powered, amazing to do it. And the problem is that it's hard. You never get 30 superpowered teachers. You get a bunch of people who really want to do right. It also makes me wonder if I've been too flippant in the way in which I've talked about this with districts. Because the flippant comment I make, it's way too flippant, is oftentimes people think, because we're the equity collaborative, that equity is a process. And I don't actually think of equity as a process. I think of equity as an outcome. It's a thing that you're trying to get to the end point. So if you want a concrete, you've been in public school for 13 years. How about we teach kids to read? That'd be great. Let's do that. The problem with that flippant statement, because I usually would follow up with something like, we know how to teach kids to read. We have plenty of research around teaching kids to read. The question now that I have after listening to Kim Marshall is, do we know how to teach kids to read? Question mark.
I think you know the answer.
Yeah.
And it's somewhat embarrassing to say there are things that we do know that we ignore, and there are things that we do know and we do excessively. And by doing it excessively, we omit some really important components.
You guys both mentioned an idea about, he said, it's very interesting now if you see the Science of Reading in Education Week or the New York Times or other places, people have gradually expanded the definition back to the real science of reading, which includes background knowledge, reading high quality children's books. And what I wrote right here is culturally responsive teaching. There's no way for any human being to learn a new thing without connecting it to an old thing in their brain. It has to, otherwise it's too foreign. It's very difficult. This is why so all the movies, the sci-fi movies, are always going to define aliens as something. It's a thing. And concept of cultural disconnection came up so many times, or cultural mismatch. Tons of different places. I thought it was just so fascinating, particularly as it relates to individual identity and collective identity. This push to PLCs. That's collective learning. Why don't they do well? Because everyone is raised individually in the US. And so there's no concept of who did it better. The only concept is I do it better and I keep it and I win.
Okay, two things. First of all, when you said culturally responsive teaching and you linked it to high quality literature, it made me wonder, why on earth do we read Charlotte's Web at every grade level every single year? Great book, but come on now. And I think about those teachers who really have been a part of, Children's Literature New England, CLNE, or they've been part of Reading the World outside the University of San Francisco, USF.
Yeah.
And these amazing resources that introduce high quality, multicultural, culturally responsive literature that allows kids to be seen and not only be seen as a folktale. So that's the first thing. The second piece, you quickly turned over to PLCs. I went, I want to talk about the culture of responsive teaching and literature.
Sure.
Come back.
Let's talk about literature.
So, no. Now I'll talk about PLCs, which I think is totally true. We are competitive by nature. We have always been graded based on, we're going to post the people's grades and you by name or by your number. We are top of the class. We are in the top 10%. We're so hyper competitive. And then all of a sudden we suggest that we should be collaborative. And so for those who are using that math approach to teaching mathematics and using it in a way that says, look, kids are going to work in small groups. They're going to be given a problem. They're going to work together to try to solve it. I'm going to be hands-off until I see that I need to intervene. That does require that I have a good amount of background knowledge and experience of understanding where kids make errors and mistakes. And at the same time, when I am now working professionally with the other people in my department or at my grade level, I'm going to do the same thing. And I'm going to feel better about asking, how did you teach that? Can I come watch? That peer coaching model, which is part of the whole transformative piece of education, as opposed to coaching for compliance and telling people what they're doing wrong.
Yeah, that's the teacher evaluation stuff that I just so resonated with. I'm like, oh, goodness, I can't tell you the number of times teacher evaluation is just terrible.
So you can see all the different directions I wanted to go in this conversation, how amazing it was to have someone like Kim Marshall as a guest, and how I was attracted to wanting to talk to him because I was like, oh, I never knew this resource existed. What this could have meant for me as an administrator. And let me say this, the amount of time he spends so clearly.
Clearly. This is what I'm like, what else does he like to do? I want to know.
You know, some people retire and they play golf nonstop. He's doing this and I like it.
Yeah, I'm like, I hope Kim Marshall also like loves to go to roller rinks or something, like loves to do their like disco roller.
You said roller rink, and this is a clear example of not having a shared image of what that means. I was like, roller derby? He seems frail. You know?
Pressure.
Yeah. What do they call it?
I'm thinking sequins and
you're thinking 80s night. 80s. Yeah.
70s night. I grew up in the 70s. So good. There were so many points at which listening to him where I'm like, I want to share this with this group. I want to share that with this group. So given his goal with the Marshall Memo, it worked. It worked in that I feel inspired to go looking for things that could be helpful to the people I support.
That's a great way to end it. Seriously, a great way to end it. So here we go. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
I'm Jamie Almanzan.
And this has been another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents of Leadership podcast. See you next week, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. At the end of every interview that we have for teacher candidates, we will say, what questions do you have for us? And they will always ask, well, what kind of support can I expect? And we will always say, well, don't worry, we'll give you a mentor. but it's not real mentorship. I mean, it's support with the difficult kid or the field trip form or the grade card, but it isn't coaching. That's where partners like EdConnective step in. They provide observation and feedback with practice. That's real coaching. Their mission is to ensure that every student thrives by facilitating exceptional educator growth. So whether it's science of reading, whether it's leadership development, whether you're trying to build the best recruitment and retention efforts, check out edconnective.com. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? It's kind of a silly question because I know you are. Empath Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with Empath Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. Empath Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools.